On the 26th of April 1999, Jill Dando, at the time one of the biggest names in British television, was shot dead in broad daylight outside her London home. Just over a year later, loner Barry George was charged with her murder. He was convicted of the crime, but 8 years later he was acquitted following a successful appeal. I'm Mark Williams-Thomas, and for the past year I've had exclusive access to the original Jill Dando police files, containing thousands of documents, intelligence reports, as well as photographs and footage never seen before. And I've uncovered evidence of a series of police failings that mean the real killer of Jill Dando may never be caught. I can reveal for the first time that over 100 potential suspects were never eliminated from the inquiry. 11 people seen near Jill's house on the morning of her murder were never identified. Meanwhile, police stand accused of using a discredited honey trap operation to target their main suspect, Barry George.
He doesn't provide any evidence in that honey trap at all that he was remotely connected to what had happened to Jill Dando.
I've uncovered a letter that suggests George's defence team was misled by the current Director of Public Prosecutions.
It's about transparency, and there hasn't been transparency in this case.
And I've discovered that police failed to properly follow up a threat to kidnap Jill, sent just weeks before she was murdered.
Jill and I had both received letters from the same handwriting from a person claiming that they wanted to capture us and rape. Well, my letter said they wanted to rape me.
And I can reveal how a convicted killer claimed he was part of an IRA cell that carried out Jill's murder. This is a story, revealed for the first time, of the failed police investigation into Britain's most high-profile unsolved murder, the Dando Files. These are amongst the final images of Jill Dando, captured on the morning of her murder, some of them shown here for the first time. The BBC TV presenter had spent the night at her fiancé Alan Farthing's house. She was now on her way home, but within 2 hours she was shot dead on the doorstep of her home in Fulham, West London.
Good evening. The TV personality Jill Dando, who as Crime Watch presenter helped to send dozens of criminals to jail, was murdered on her own doorstep today. She was killed by a single gunshot to her head.
Her brutal killing, carried out in broad daylight, made headlines around the world.
Between 11:45 and 12 o'clock, the body of a woman was found outside number 29 Gowan Avenue. That woman has been taken to Charing Cross Hospital, and that woman has been declared dead shortly after 1 o'clock.
At the time, she was one of the BBC's best-loved faces, presenting programmes including Crime Watch and Holiday. But who would want to kill Jill Dando? And why?
Jill Dando was a replica, if that's the proper word to use, but certainly represented the Diana of the media world. She'd been chosen to actually present the Millennium BBC broadcast. She was on the front of the Radio Times. She was a key figure for the BBC. She was a well-liked figure as far as the BBC were concerned. So the killing of a woman of that stature in broad daylight captured attention, well, throughout the world, but certainly within the United Kingdom. So very high profile, a lot was at stake for everyone, particularly the police.
Jill Dando's death sparked what was about to become the Metropolitan Police's biggest murder inquiry and the largest criminal investigation since the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper. It was named Operation Oxborough, its head, Detective Chief Inspector Hamish Campbell. For the past 12 months, I've had exclusive access to thousands of files and documents gathered as part of that operation. Now, for the first time, I can reveal how the investigation unfolded. Were there flaws in the original inquiry that allowed whoever killed Jill Dando to escape capture? Detectives were up against it from the outset. There were no eyewitnesses to the crime. A bullet was found at the scene, but no murder weapon. And what of a motive? There was speculation the killer could be a jealous lover or stalker, or a criminal who had been featured on Crime Watch. A third theory was that there was a Serbian link to her murder, because Jill had presented an appeal on behalf of the Kosovan refugees in the weeks before her death.
This Easter weekend, we've all become aware of the humanitarian crisis facing the Balkans as thousands of people from Kosovo have left their homes and arrived on the borders of neighbouring countries. This is a massive exodus. Around 600,000 people are on the move.
At the time, there was a war in the Balkans, and ethnic Albanians in Kosovo were fighting Serbs for independence. The files of Operation Oxborough reveal the Serbian theory was one that was taken seriously by detectives at the start of the investigation. There were very real fears that other BBC personalities were in danger following a series of death threats in the wake of Jill's murder. Those targeted included Tony Hall, now the BBC's Director General. At the time, he was the head of news. There were also threats against executive Alan Yentop and presenter John Humphreys. But what hasn't been known up until now is that 3 other BBC colleagues also faced threats. Police carried out a risk assessment on Jill's Crime Watch co-presenter, Nick Ross, after a threat was sent to BBC Bristol. And just 3 days after Jill's murder, 2 calls were received at BBC TV Centre, threatening to kill Watchdog presenter Anne Robinson and Alice Beer. Alice, who worked alongside Jill at the time, was filming in the Canary Islands when the death threats were made. She has agreed to speak for the first time about what happened. So a phone call comes in to Television Centre on the 29th of April 1999, and it says, from Serbia, going to kill Anne Robinson, Alice Beer and 2 others. What did you know about that?
I received a call. I was still away filming in the Canary Islands, and obviously we were still all in a state of shock, especially being away from home, away from where everyone was. I received a phone call from the deputy editor of Watchdog reporting what had happened and saying there has been a death threat against you. And of course we'd heard about this strange Serbian connection at the time, but it just sounded really bizarre. It didn't make sense. So yes, it was quite shocking and quite scary, and I was told you'll definitely be picked up from the airport. But that was literally it. That phone call saying there has been a death threat. And
what happens thereafter? So how do the police do the investigation and what do they say to you?
Well, when I got home, of course, we wanted to know what was happening in the investigation, wanted to speak to people. I waited for the police to call and waited for them to talk to me as a work colleague of Jill's, as somebody who worked in the next door office, as somebody who did the same job as her. And that call never came. I was never interviewed. I didn't know if I had anything to offer. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't, but I was surprised that they hadn't called me. Then I waited for follow-up on the death threat, and nothing happened, which I was very surprised about. Even just closure, even just we've dismissed this. This was, we've traced it and it really wasn't valid.
So from the paperwork, I can tell you that in direct relation to that phone call that happened on that day to both yourself and Anne Robinson as threats, is that it was traced to a phone box in Gerrard's Cross. Is that the first time you knew that?
Yeah, yep, yes. But I was never told that. That's bizarre, isn't it?
But there was another reason why Alice was shocked not to be contacted by police. I can reveal that just weeks before Jill's murder, both Jill and Alice had received threatening letters, apparently from the same person.
I think only a month or so before, I was aware that Jill and I had both received letters from the same handwriting, from a person claiming that they wanted to capture us and rape. Well, my letter said they wanted to rape me. And I knew that both those letters, one addressed to Jill and one addressed to me, were being investigated by Shepherd's Bush Police at the time. And I thought, gosh, that's strange that there's another tie-in, and yet nobody spoke to me about it. Nobody questioned anything. And I thought, okay, well, they are pursuing their own lines of inquiry. They obviously know exactly what they're doing. They've got a definite lead, and these things have all become irrelevant. And I've questioned it over the years, but those questions never really been answered in my mind.
So you never had any contact with the police in relation to the specific Serbian threat. Mm-hmm. You never had any contact with the police in terms of knowing Jill as a work colleague, and even more importantly, the fact that you'd also had a similar threat to her with regards to rape. No contact with the police?
No contact with the police.
Back at Operation Oxborough, It was now 4 days since Jill Dando's murder, and the pressure was on to catch the person responsible. Though no one had seen the killer, police had an e-fit of a possible suspect. He'd been seen emerging from Bishop's Park near Jill's home and waiting at a bus stop on the Fulham Palace Road. He was described as late 30s or early 40s, 5 foot 11 inches tall, with dark hair. After the e-fit was released, detectives were swamped with calls from the public. The files of Operation Oxborough reveal among the names suggested were some well-known public figures. They included documentary maker Louis Theroux, chef Jean-Christophe Novelli, and presenter Georges Allegaya. None of these men were interviewed by police. There is no suggestion any of them were connected with Jill's murder. But another person, whose name appeared on the e-fit suspect list, was interviewed by a detective, Alistair Campbell, at the time Prime Minister Tony Blair's press secretary. He told police that at the time of Jill's murder he was at home with his partner. Detectives had also received information that Mr. Campbell was an ex-boyfriend of Jill's. He denied this. There is no suggestion he is in any way linked to Jill's death. But he's not the only high-profile person whose name appears in police files. In the late 80s, Jill began working on BBC Breakfast. One of her colleagues at the time was journalist Jeremy Paxman. The police files reveal Paxman gave a statement to detectives following her death. He told them he and Jill had got to know each other pretty well in the late 80s, but he hadn't seen or spoken to her for almost a year. Someone who had seen Jill just a month before her murder was singer Cliff Richard. Mr. Richard was interviewed by detectives in the weeks following Jill's death. In a statement he said the pair had become close friends. He had even offered to host her wedding reception. He said the last time he had seen her had been at the home of Robin Williams. He said he couldn't think of anyone who would have a motive for her murder. It's now 3 weeks since Jill's murder, and the man leading the investigation, DCI Hamish Campbell, was preparing to go on the BBC's Crime Watch programme to appeal for information. Police still didn't know if Jill's murder was committed by a loner or if it was a professional hit. Could key information about the gun used in her killing provide the breakthrough they desperately needed?
Hamish Campbell, let's see how viewers can really help.
This is a 9mm short. Not only is the bullet shorter, but the whole weapon is smaller. It can be held in your palm of your hand, can be concealed in a pocket. People need to look now at this weapon. Have they recently handled this gun? Have they recently passed it on to somebody else? Have they disposed of it for somebody? Did they make arrangements before Monday the 26th of April to give this type of gun to somebody? There is the reward money. People need to look at this firearm and ring us tonight.
Despite hundreds of calls, there appeared to be no significant leads as a result of the programme. Detectives were still struggling to find a motive for Jill's murder. Could someone close to Jill be the killer? I've discovered a document in police files that was drawn up 3 months after that Crime Watch appeal. Its title is Close Associates with Possible Motives. But in September 1999, police received a tip-off from a usually reliable informant. They were told that a mechanic from East London was the possible assassin, and for 2 months he was put under 24-hour surveillance. But following new information, police realised that their initial tip-off had been false and that he had nothing to do with the murder. DCI Hamish Campbell was now forced to review the investigation. Why, when there was an unprecedented £250,000 reward on offer, had no one named the killer? In the months following Jill's death, DCI Campbell had commissioned 2 reports from clinical psychologist Dr. Adrian West. Those reports seemed to support the theory that a lone obsessive was responsible for Jill's murder. And almost a year into the investigation, the focus of the inquiry changed. Loner Barry George became the main suspect. He lived just 10 minutes from Jill, and messages about him had been sent to the police in the days following the murder. On April the 6th, 2000, he was interviewed by police. A warrant was issued and his flat was searched on the 18th and 19th of April 2000. In these images, the chaotic world of their prime suspect is laid bare. George was unemployed, had learning difficulties, Asperger's syndrome and suffered epilepsy. What's more, he had a previous conviction for attempted rape. Detectives also found gun magazines at the flat. He was known as a local oddball and seemed to fit their profile. Today, 15 years later, the memories of what happened then are still vivid for Barry George.
Prior to the murder, had you ever met Jill Dando?
Never met her in my life.
Had you ever had any communication with her?
Don't know her, don't know where she lives.
Had you ever been up her road? You didn't know she lived in that road?
I didn't know her at all, you know. And no sense. I didn't even know she lived in the area or who she was. But they didn't want to believe that.
Barrister Ian Glenn QC has been representing Barry George since 2008.
Why do you think the police were so convinced that Barry George was responsible for Jill Dando's murder?
Well, I think that when they raided his flat and they found evidence of some interesting guns, although it was a long time beforehand, hordes of newspapers and so on, they found, no doubt, pictures of Jill Dando in those newspapers, but they weren't circled or cut out or in any way marked to suggest any obsession. He just hoarded loads and loads of newspapers. And I think that they found him, in their terms, to be rather weird, and that's what led them to believe he was guilty.
Just 24 hours after police finished their search of Barry George's flat, DCI Hamish Campbell went on the BBC's Crime Watch programme for a second time.
We asked for those linkings between the gun, the loner, the obsessive, the ability to be in Fulham, and people are ringing in with that sort of information, very precise, a lot of names.
I wanted to show that appeal to Professor of Criminology, Dr. David Wilson, himself a former police profiler.
The Crime Watch appeal, which I hadn't seen before, comes only 2 days after the police have searched Barry George's flat. So for me, the appeal and the search of Barry George's flat are actually indivisible. Barry George isn't mentioned in the Crime Watch appeal, but quite clearly the police are hoping that that appeal can dredge up other circumstantial evidence which will add to the case against Barry George. The police are simply looking for evidence to convict as opposed to keeping all of their options open. And by narrowing down those options to one particular person, you have a problem. And that problem is you search for evidence that convicts that individual as opposed to look for evidence which is contraindicative of that individual.
And what hasn't been known until now is that an undercover female police officer was sent to gather evidence on George. Contained in the files is a transcript of a conversation between Barry and the officer, known as Sonia. She befriended him at an internet cafe in London, just a month after the second Crime Watch appeal. Professor David Wilson believes this amounted to a so-called honey trap operation.
What they seem to be doing, and I've read the transcript of the tapes from that honey trap, is that they seem to be trying to get Barry George to admit to the particular police officer that he was in some way involved in the murder of Jill Dando. Now, what's interesting is that the conversation with the police officer undercover reveals that Barry George was a fantasist. I mean, that I don't think there's any doubt that here we have a rather odd, bizarre individual who lived locally, but he doesn't provide any evidence in that honey trap at all that he was remotely connected to what had happened to Jill Dando.
I showed the transcript to the man who would go on to defend Barry at the Old Bailey, Barrister Michael Mansfield.
It has all the hallmarks of a desperate investigation. In other words, one in which they really hadn't managed to, as it were, highlight the responsible person. And they'd done it because they'd made all sorts of assumptions, and it's led to desperate measures. The use of the honey trap just discloses that this particular investigation had predetermined what they wanted to find. In other words, at the end of the day, they wanted a loner, they wanted Barry George. And I think that sort of targeting the usual suspects comes to mind. that they have a suspect in mind and then they get the evidence to fit it, rather than the rather more open-minded approach to life where you trawl. It may take longer, it may take a bigger squad of officers to do it, but and you have to have objectivity, has to determine from beginning to end.
But in May 2000 came a potential breakthrough for detectives. A scientist had made what appeared to be an important discovery. In the inside pocket of an overcoat hanging over the kitchen door in Barry's home, he found a tiny particle, which he said could be firearms discharge residue, or FDR from the gun used in the shooting. Barry George was arrested on the 25th of May 2000 and 4 days later charged with Jill Dando's murder.
Did you kill Jill Dando, Mr. George?
No, sir.
In these police interviews, never seen before, he is asked about his knowledge of guns and ammunition.
Do you know the difference between a blank firing gun and a replica gun?
Not in detail, no.
Do you know in any way the difference?
I believe that, well, no, to be truthful.
He told detectives he had owned 2 guns in the past.
Have you purchased any other guns other than the 2 you've just mentioned to me?
Just the 2 I just mentioned, sir.
I think you're lying, Mr. George. Is there a reason?
To my knowledge, that is the only 2 that I purchased, sir.
Seems to me, Mr. George, you certainly possessed at least 2 weapons, 2 firearms, if not 3, whether they be replica, blank firing, or imitation firearms. That's right, isn't it? At least 2, if not 3. Is that right, Mr. George?
Only those 2, sir.
Did you kill Jill Dando?
No, sir.
You obviously had firearm ammunition to use in your blank firing gun, as we've discussed. Is that correct, Mr. George?
They were just capsules, sir, that, as I said, go bang, and that's all they do.
But if you put a bullet on the end of that capsule and put it in a gun that could fire with a smooth barrel,
it couldn't do nothing, so it would blow up in your own face, because obviously nothing can go out of the end.
So since that time, when you used that firearm to shoot your blank weapon, blank ammunition, have you ever bought or possessed any other firearm ammunition?
No, sir.
Did you kill Jill Dando?
No, sir.
The person who killed Miss Dando was seen leaving the area. He was wearing a dark 3/4 length coat. You have stated in interview that on that day you may have been wearing a 3/4 length coat. Was that you leaving the scene of the crime, Mr. George?
Or casual appearance, sir.
Exactly. Was that you leaving the scene of the crime, Mr. George?
No, sir.
Your 3/4 length coat was taken from your flat upon search by the police.
Sir.
That coat has also been examined by a firearms expert, firearms laboratory. Did you kill Jill Dando, Mr. George?
No, sir.
The inside pocket of your coat has been found to have a trace of percussion primer discharge residue. Did you kill Jill Dando, Mr. George?
No, sir.
How do you explain the firearms residue in your coat pocket, Mr. George? The coat pocket, the 3/4 length coat that you may have been wearing on the day that Jill Dando was killed. How do you explain that?
I can't explain. I have no knowledge. But then, even though...
Of course you haven't. But how did it get there, Mr. George?
I have no idea, sir.
In July 2000, Barry George was awaiting the trial for the murder of Jill Dando. detectives had what appeared to be compelling forensic evidence against him. But the files of Operation Oxborough reveal that at this stage the man leading the investigation, DCI Hamish Campbell, commissioned a third report. He briefed clinical psychologist Dr. Adrian West on Barry George and asked him to assess Barry's possible motivation for the murder. Professor David Wilson believes this report and the previous 2 reports amount to criminal profiles.
I think there are huge dangers in constructing a profile after there has been an arrest and charge of a suspect, specifically Barry George, because then what you're doing through the profile is you are providing reassurance to the police that they've got the right person. Generally, profiles can't do that, and specifically what you therefore are in danger of is not continuing to be a critical friend to the police. You have to give them contraindications as much as, say, suggesting avenues that they could also interview them about. For me, the third profile that was constructed wouldn't be something that I would be comfortable in doing.
Now, Barry George's Old Bailey trial was just 6 months away. His defence team wanted to know if police had prepared offender profiles as part of their investigation. They asked Alison Saunders, the current Director of Public Prosecutions. At the time, she was the Assistant Chief Crown Prosecutor. But I've uncovered a letter dated January 2001, in which she says there is not in existence a psychological offender profile. None were disclosed to the defence team. I showed the profiles to Michael Mansfield QC, Barry George's trial barrister.
3 offender profiles were done. You were told none existed. What does that tell you?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons why they didn't tell us, and I think an offender profile is really talking about not an individual, but a type of person to look for. They obviously can't pinpoint. So, number one, they may not want to reveal that they've done this because, one, it may reveal that there's a sort of air of desperation, that they're having to do this. 2, that the descriptions given in the profiles of the general type don't marry closely the person who ends up in the dock. And thirdly, which is the disturbing feature about this one, is that a profile of the offender was compiled, a third one, after Barry George had been charged. And the profile, interestingly, wasn't of a type. It was, in fact, giving characteristics which matched Barry George. In other words, what they were doing, which is what we feared they were doing, was targeting a weird, bizarre man, and then, having got him charged, they get, as it were, they're reinforced in their beliefs by a profile. Of course, and we didn't see any of that. A profile which tends to support that it was Barry George. Well, wait a minute, this is self-supporting evidence. And I think that whole process of denial that there were any, and the fact that in the end they get one after he was charged, which actually points exactly to him, suggests the whole process is tainted.
And that, even from an outsider, that raises serious questions about both professional and ethical issues about Operation Oxborough.
Oh, I think there's no question about that, yeah.
Do you think Hamish Campbell and Alison Saunders, the now DPP, have questions to answer?
They've got to be asked what they knew about these profiles and the fact that there was a denial by somebody who is now the Director of Public Prosecutions. Absolutely, these questions have got to be asked. Now, either they've got to be asked, by the IPCC and then a file sent on, but certainly the questions have got to be asked. And really, the public need transparency, because that's what disclosure is about. It's about transparency, and there hasn't been transparency in this case.
A Crown Prosecution spokesperson said in a statement,
"This was a letter written almost 15 years ago. It was written in good faith at the time."
In July 2001, Barry George was convicted of the murder of Jill Dando and sentenced to life imprisonment. The forensic evidence of the gunshot residue had seemed compelling.
Tell me how you feel the moment that verdict comes back from the jury when they announce, Barry George, you're guilty of the murder of Jill Dando.
From conscience point of view, I knew I hadn't done it. From a factual point of view, as the circumstances of events unfolded, I knew I hadn't done it, and it just beggared belief.
Did you ever think you would get out of jail?
I was not sure either way. I had hope. I didn't ever lose hope.
In 2008, after 8 years in jail, Barry George was acquitted of Jill Dando's murder following a successful appeal. The same forensic evidence that had helped convict him had been discredited.
Barry, can you forgive the Metropolitan Police for prosecuting you?
I can forgive, but I can't forget.
But had the police's focus on Barry George meant they'd overlooked other potential vital leads? In the files of Operation Oxborough, I've discovered a document that was released to Barry George's defence team in the run-up to his trial. It lists over 380 suspects in the case. But more than 100 of those suspects were never seen by police. A second document reveals 11 people in and around Gowan Avenue on the morning of Jill's death were never identified by officers.
Were you concerned that avenues of the investigation just weren't being closed down?
Yes, I remember that in the first trial we were, both in front of the jury and in submissions to the judge, we were concerned about the vast range of people. And one of the problems was, of course, the police were saying there were so many people that it took a long time to work their way through and who rose to the top and so on. So I appreciated they obviously had a lot of suspects to deal with. But this was an extremely important area because we decided that in this particular case, just saying he wasn't guilty wasn't going to be enough. A jury, given the prejudice and everything else, would want to say, well, if it wasn't him, then who was it? And so, you know, I think it would have been unrealistic just to leave it hanging in the air. So we took a joint decision that it was desirable to see if we could do an alternative, if you like, framework for the jury to consider, which means looking at who the others were. Well, we did, in fact, in the trial, produce an alternative framework, which was to do with Serbia, to do with her, that is Jill Dando's broadcasts and so on, and that this was retribution on the BBC for the fact that a television station in Yugoslavia belonging to Milosevic had been bombed, and people, I think it was 17 people killed. So that's why we constructed that. However, you never want to be exclusive and say that's the only possibility to a jury. That is a possibility. Now, if there are other possibilities from other suspects, of course we would have looked at that. We did what the police did. We tried to look at the most credible suspects. Now, what I find disturbing is, of course, that of the 100 others who haven't been followed up, you know, we've got a considerable number here that have not been excluded.
Why was a Serbian factor an important one?
Well, the Serbian aspect's important because it provides an alternative. And it provided the alternative because there was political pressure at that time in relation to what was going on in the Balkans. And Milosevic, a TV tower belonging to him had been bombed, 17 people killed, and so we were saying this was retribution. Also, a part of the materials found at the scene was a crimped cartridge. Now, a crimped cartridge is a cartridge which held a bullet, but to hold the bullet, it's had to be pinched to hold it. That means it's not manufactured in a mass production way. Where did bullets of that kind come from? They're not readily available. And of course, they come from the Balkans, or they were used in the Balkans. They're of Russian manufacture. So we had another factor here. This wasn't some wild suggestion. So there was something at the scene and something in the background that linked the two, that the possibility was this could have been, as I say, a Serbian hit.
In the files of Operation Oxborough, I've discovered a series of intelligence reports supporting the theories of a possible Serbian link to Jill Dando's murder. One said the men who organised the killing were regulars at a named West End club where they planned the murder. And there are other reports referring to other named individuals with a Serbian connection. It's not known if these men were ever traced or interviewed. Some experts believe Jill Dando's murder was a professional killing and say police were wrong to end up focusing on the theory a loner was responsible. Last year, Professor of Criminology Dr. David Wilson published a report on contract killings.
I have absolutely no doubt that Jill Dando's murder has all the hallmarks of a professional hit. The fact it was a single shot, the fact that the gun was in contact with her head, the fact that there were the gun casing had been left is not contraindication of a professional hit. Indeed, I have researched many professional hits where the gun itself is left. Therefore, that doesn't rule out a professional hit for me, nor the fact that there are witnesses that this happened during the day, or indeed that this was at her doorstep. Everything about this murder screams out professional hit.
Back in 1999, Tony Thompson covered Jill's murder for the Observer newspaper. He has since gone on to write a series of books about Britain's underworld. He has met contract killers as part of this research.
Jill was killed with a single shot to the head. What does that tell you?
It tells you that it's someone who would have done something like this before. I think if you were trying to do this for the first time and you never had any experience of firearms or experience of killing, you'd probably be tempted to put more than one shot into the person just to make sure they were dead. I think when you look at the specifics of how the shot was fired, how close the gun was to her head, even the type of weapon used, it all points to someone who has a great deal of experience of using firearms in the past and of killing in the past as well.
Now, you've studied the case closely. What do you think about the crime scene and about how the crime occurred?
Well, I think there was a huge amount of planning involved in the crime because to actually be able to be there at the right time, in the right position, without being seen by anybody else, to leave so little evidence or so little useful evidence, it really does show that there was a huge amount of planning that went into this beforehand.
Michael Mansfield asked police during Barry George's Old Bailey trial about the theory Jill's murder was a contract killing.
They were saying, no, this wasn't a contract killing. We've looked at this and we can rule it out. Well, sorry, I don't know how they were able to rule it out. And this is what's always concerned me. You have to remember that she very rarely went to the house she went to, which she was living with her fiancé most of the time. So this was rare to find her in the road. So somebody had to know that she was going to go to the house at a particular time, or at least have intelligence on the day that she was going to go to the house. This isn't going to be Barry George. Number two, you've got to secrete yourself in the street. So when she drives up Narrow Street in Fulham, that she does not notice there's somebody, waiting outside the house? This is a terraced house with a tiny garden. There is no way in which somebody can be hiding there and not seen by Jill Dando as she gets out of the car. She parks a BMW. She's only got about 10, 20 yards to walk to get to the front door. But by the time she's got to the front door, there's somebody behind her with a gun, left ear, shot, clean shot, and they're away.
Again, in the police files, I've discovered a series of named individuals who it's suggested have links to the criminal underworld and were responsible for Jill's murder. One intelligence report names 2 North London men. It suggests a motive for the killings linked to her work on Crime Watch. It also gives details of how and when the gun was disposed of. But there is a note on the document saying DCI Campbell ordered no further action. At the time, Barry George was in custody.
The document we have names 2 individuals, gives specific information and says on the instructions of Hamish Campbell, no further action. Is that a concern?
Well, I think this particular piece of information is of the greatest importance from my point of view. If I don't recollect seeing it, and if their names are not on the list, we wouldn't necessarily therefore have been looking for it. We had a list, obviously. We did know the whole range of people were suspected, but I don't recall that. That's very specific information. And we would have wanted to follow that up. And I would have wanted to present the jury, or at least if I could follow it up, at least present the jury with the possibility, because it seems that the intelligence is very specific and very clear. Now, the question I would have wanted to ask Campbell, and he gave evidence obviously, is why was this one not followed up on his instructions? Is it because he'd formed a view that it had to be Barry George?
But back in 2001, after Barry George was sentenced, I can reveal that someone did actually confess to Jill Dando's murder, and he was already a convicted killer. Wayne Ed was serving life in Wakefield prison after killing his flatmate. The killing happened just 2 months after Jill was murdered. In a detailed letter running to over 10 pages, he says he was part of a real IRA cell which carried out the killing. He gave the confession to Leeds-based solicitor Stuart Page. Mr. Page told me Ed's account appeared credible.
You were happy that what he was telling you certainly needed following up, and it didn't appear to be a make-believe, it appeared to be genuine.
For the past 12 months, I've scoured through the thousands of documents of Operation Oxborough. There appears to be clear concerns about how that investigation was carried out. With so many questions hanging over the original police investigation into Jill Dando's murder, is it now time for a fresh inquiry?
Jill Dando's family still don't know who the killer is. What should happen now?
Well, look, this is still an unsolved crime. I don't know why we aren't reopening this case to reconsider it in the light of the increasing knowledge we have about professional hits on mainland Britain. And I think if we started to pursue that avenue, we might come to some better conclusion as to who killed Jill Dando, and by doing so, allow her family to at least know that the culprit or culprits have been brought to justice.
Well, I think there needs to be an open-minded review of what is now cold case, and perhaps more attention paid to the gun and the nature of that, and to the possibility that it was a professional assassin, and to follow the myriad of other leads that there are in the case.
What needs to happen now?
Well, I think the case should never be closed, and there should be a proper investigation, and possibly under a new squad of officers, not the same ones. First point. Second point, Home Secretary absolutely must investigate the non-disclosure and the tenor and the nature of the investigation, which we've already touched upon, it's the quality of the investigation. The only way she can do that is what she's done in the Lawrence case and in other cases. You appoint a high-ranking barrister, QC, who sits down and does an independent review, and the one in the Lawrence case was extremely effective and extremely quick.
The Metropolitan Police said in a statement,
"The Metropolitan Police Service fully investigated the circumstances into the murder of Jill Dando. 2 trials took place and the investigation was subject to an internal review. If any new information comes to our attention, then this will be investigated."
Meanwhile, for Jill Dando's family and friends, the agony goes on.
The first people who are victims of, if anyone, are the family of Miss Dando. And I will never, ever take that away, even if I could, right? I will never even try to take that away from them. They are victims before our family and myself ever are.
Oh, I should think everyone who knew Jill, loved Jill, wants to know who really did kill Jill Dando. I haven't trawled through the evidence as you have, but it seems to be very obvious that if Barry George didn't kill Jill, then somebody else did. And of course that person needs to be found guilty.
Jill Dando's family have the biggest concern, because they will be saying to themselves, it's all very well for you, the state, the police, to close the case, but it can't close for us until we know that in fact all the proper leads have been investigated, and in fact we've come to a situation in which we can see the potential for prosecuting the correct person.